Okay, you're good to start. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Good evening, everyone. It's Wednesday, May 20th. We're joining together for our next Housing Commission meeting on the Affordable Housing Ordinance. First, want to start off by thanking everyone for joining, taking the time tonight. So let me see, starting off first. And Alex, if you don't mind, can you send the agenda in the chat just so that everyone has the opportunity to look over it one more time before we begin? I know it was sent out earlier through the public notice, but just so that everyone has an opportunity to have it on hand. But while it's getting done, we'll move past public comment, seeing that there are no individuals who wanted to come for us today. And next, move over to reflections on the April working group meeting. So for those who attended, really appreciate you joining us. It was a great meeting. I really loved a lot of the input given from not only the audience, but of course our wonderful panel of individuals who were a part of the process back in 2005 when we initially had this conversation. Thank you again, especially to not only Russell for getting us through the beginning part of the program, being able to get us a good overview of what the process is and what the ordinance, the context of which the ordinance was written, but also all those in staff who helped us not only record, but facilitate the meeting. So first I want to open it up to anyone tonight who either was in person or watched the meeting to get any feedback on our April working group meeting.
I'll go ahead and start.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Jason.
Yeah, so I thought it was a very good perspective, especially because I wasn't here in Arlington 20 years ago when this happened, so it's really great to get the backstory and history. And the things that stuck out to me is one, of course, everyone collaborating and kind of finding the, I guess, sweet spot of feasibility, and I think that's really important. And then the second thing I took away that was really important was the really ability to leverage AHIP funds. The question was asked about on-site versus off-site, and the ability to leverage funds to provide more housing for people off-site. I think was a really powerful, because yes, if you do on-site, you can provide a family, but then if you take that same amount of money, you can get 4 families. And I think that depending on our projections of the CAFs that we need, if we lean towards more on-site, then that could that will decrease the number of CAFs that we'll have to make up somewhere else, which I don't know how we're going to do that. So that was my big takeaways.
All right, thank you so much for your feedback. And yeah, I do recall, I think it was Jay Facette actually who made that point. And I think it was a very astute point, seeing as how oftentimes our view of housing is very centered on what's directly on site, right? And to your point, Jason, I think if we look at this as just a question of how much affordable housing is being brought online instead of necessarily thinking of where it is, it may offer some additional avenues for us to meet our housing goals without constraining that supply. Thank you. Any additional questions or points? Yes, Audrey.
Being new to this too, I learned a tremendous amount, but what impressed me the most was how much time and how many people were involved in the first ordinance, and a little intimidated by the idea that we could get something new worded, accepted, pushed through by the end of the year or earlier. So I'm not sure I understand what's going to be different this time than last time. Are we just making some tweaks to it? Are we going back and revisiting it in its entirety? So I'm unsure about the scope of our project.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
Brian,
and before I answer that, Joe, please.
yeah, Brian, that was kind of my question. I mean, the last session was great, and I lived here then, and I heard about Varna Valley. I didn't know what it was all about and stuff like that. So the whole history of this was extremely important and put things in perspective, et cetera. So we're the work group of the Housing Commission. In 2005, Jay Fassett was the chairman of the county board, and he headed up this ordinance thing. So that was at a much higher level. So my question is, we're a work group of the Housing Commission. We're going to be doing the due diligence on this and what possibly making recommendations. What is the time frame? And then the county board, and then the bigger issue, the elephant in the room, is really the state legislature and the politics of state politics and the Dillon rule and stuff like that. So I think we have to take on this task with all of that, in the perspective.
Yes, no, and those are great questions. And I think I'll try to answer them both because they kind of work off of each other. So yes, first to Audrey's question, what's the scope? I think that's the first question, if I remember correctly. What's the scope of our work? Something that I think people here should take heart in is that we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? Like that was kind of the hard, heavy lifting from 20 years ago. And I think that's one of the intuitions that we should take away, is that there's already a very elegant framework in place. The main question, as I understand it, which has been illuminated by it was a 2023 report that the county commissioned, done by a contractor to kind of evaluate the status of the affordable housing ordinance. The question really is, are developers paying a relatively appropriate share into AHIF in lieu of caps now versus what they did 20 years ago? The answer pretty clearly was no, right? That we are getting anywhere between a third to half of the value of money that we should be getting to AHIF. And so really, we're going to be looking specifically at a particular provision of Virginia code that specifies the ratios effectively of how much in-kind contribution to AHIF would be required under state code. Now, this actually is featured in one of tonight's reading materials. And I noticed, Alex, I don't know if you can put in the chat a link to the current formula page, because what was sent around was Virginia code, which gives you the numbers from 2005, but we have an idea of approximately how much we need to increase AHIF by to be at parity of what we were doing back in 2005. That's really what the focus of this will be. Now, we'll have a larger conversation over the next coming months about, what are nearby localities doing. That will be kind of the focus of next month's meeting, right? What is Fairfax County doing with their affordable housing ordinance? What is Alexandria doing with theirs? But the central issue is not to rewrite the entire ordinance, right? It's specifically to take a look at a particular provision and then update that, right? We're doing an update, not a rewrite. And so I hope that kind of clarifies and assuages some concerns, right? Because you're right, this is a fairly short timeline, but I think it's well within our abilities given the scope of the ask. And yes, Joe, to your point, this is something that we're going to have to get passed through the General Assembly, right? I know there are a number of people here on the call that have that sort of legislative advocacy experience. I would consider myself somewhat of a novice in that regard compared to some on the call, but I think many of us do understand how this thing goes and the timeline of it. Really, we need to be looking at August, September, trying to get a tangible into the hands of our legislators, get circled around so that people have an idea of what they're going to be advocating for, because really these bills, they're typically finalized within individual legislators' packages by November. Right. So we have to be thinking along this timeline of not only do we need to get this in front of General Housing Commission and then the county board, but also prepped and ready for legislators. Another component, of course, is the question of who wins the governor's mansion, right, this November. I personally don't believe that if we don't have a change in the current administration, that we won't have the opportunity for this, right? I think it will depend on whether or not a Democrat wins in November, and so that's an added level of uncertainty there. But we're getting this prepped and ready, so under whatever conditions, we'll have something for our legislators. Yes, Eric.
Yeah, I was really sorry that I couldn't make the last meeting, but I did. I was able to watch it. I think my one takeaway was, I think it's always helpful to be specific, like you're speaking to, Brian. But I think, thinking about how this all came to be, it kind of reminds me of a lot of things in life where you're kind of back into the right answer, or you're not quite sure like how you're going to get there, but you just kind of have to move forward. And somehow, if you've got enough, persistence and determination, you'll find a way. And I think that what wasn't really talked about very understandably in that roundtable was, the insistence on community, from community members. And we obviously had one, community member talk about civic associations, but, Arna Valley was really the catalyst of what happened at Arna Valley, right? And a lot of other events. And I think what happened outside those conversations in that working group with the county board was far, far more important, with all due respect to the conversations they had, because that really framed the conversation, which was essentially that there was a critical mass in the community who said, this is a value that we need to act on, and we need to figure out a way forward. And then you leave it up to the experts, your elected officials, your staff, who work with our development partners. And then, that, is the catalyst for a deal. So thinking about our working group here, I think, while specific recommendations are great, my thing is, I would hope most folks in this group kind of agree with the sentiment that we should have more affordable housing, that we're happy with the progress we've made, but we're not satisfied. And so even if we can come to some general agreement on principles on things, and even if that's kind of one of the more basic ones, I think that's an incredibly helpful, and that certainly drives that conversation forward. I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that we as a group can do, even if we have disagreements on how we get there, if it's revising contributions from developers, for example, or maybe other parts outside the ordinance, like Carmen Romero talking about tax abatements, which are not within the ordinance, but maybe that's something we also want legislative changes to. So I think some general principles that this group could agree on or not is going to be the most compelling, because we really need to give that to the decision makers in the room, who are ultimately going to decide whether to pursue things like legislation and negotiations with stakeholders. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And actually, I want to open it up again to everyone on a question that I think Joe has very correctly illuminated, which is the aspect of public engagement, right? And I think that's something that we have to be constantly thinking about, especially as we get later into this process around people's awareness of our work, what we are here to do, what we're not going to be doing, and just ensuring that folks know that we're on the case here, right? We're trying to do something beneficial for the county and to include the public, so that there is a sense that this was done in broad daylight, that a bunch of folks just didn't kind of go into a back closet and then come out with something in August, September, and everyone's like, okay, you guys did this, but like, where's the paper trail? Like, what did you do here? So that's something else that I'd love to get feedback on. And yes, Matt, I see your question, but give me just 1 second to get answers on this one. Oh, Joe, you're muted.
Okay, yeah, I totally agree. And one of the things that I feel strongly about on engagement, and I look at this in the lens of missing middle, and I've lived in this county 50 years, and missing middle was a bunch of things that was poorly brought out. It happened during COVID, lack of information, all that stuff. One of the things that impressed me since I've been on the Housing Commission, I did this tour of all the affordable housing. We have great affordable housing stories in this county. And it's not, you know, an eightplex in Country Club Hills and stuff like that. So I believe what we have to do, we have to have better engagement, better transparency with the citizens of Arlington that see this stuff. You see what I'm saying? So we're talking about engagement, but I'm also talking about basically communicating what we're doing so the people understand what this is. I mean, we have some great affordable housing. I'm in Roslyn here. We have Quincy Court, which is a very nice facility where the Mirabella is coming up. We have the Red Cross building off Route 50. There's a lot of nice stuff around here. And I think the people that get skittish about affordable housing, they're thinking all different things. I think that the more that we're transparent about it, the people will be more accepting, and we wouldn't have the pushback that we had during missing middle. I don't know if that makes sense, but I feel strongly about it.
Yeah, no, I think I understand. So I guess a way to kind of tease out that latter part of your statement, it seems like a lot of the concern that's coming from people is around their impression of what affordable housing is, right? And you know, to be clear, a lot of these developments we're working on aren't definitionally affordable housing. We're asking for more committed affordable units, but I think your central point on this is still valid, which is people are going to have anxiety about any sort of major change, right, in their community.
Or an ordinance allowing for more affordable housing and stuff like that, they will have pushback. But if they see what it isn't concentrations of poverty and stuff like that, that all the naysayers would say. So that's what I'm getting at.
Yeah, no, thank you. Great point. And I do intend on making that a priority, especially in, I would say, July-ish, when we have more of a tangible in hand of going to different communities and civic association meetings and just talking to people about what we're doing. And I'd be glad to have members join me, because I think it's important that we do get ahead of this. And as you said, make it clear about what this is going to look like and how it's going to, you know, just seamlessly blend in with the community, and how people really, if they know what it will look like, if they understand how we got here, I think personally that they'll be far more amenable to whatever change we're going to make. But Matt, I remember your hand was up, so you took it down.
No, it's all right. Keep going.
Okay, Jason.
Yeah, I think education is important, and it's not just education coming in, but it's also going out and understanding how much of what we change, how much increased potential new affordable housing we can get. You know, it was said in the meeting that there was about $197 million to AHIF over the past 20 years, which if you just, you know, baseline calc $100,000 per one, you know, unit, that's about 2,500 units over 20 years. So about 250 units a year. And according to our AHMP needs, we need to be producing 731 CAFs per year going forwards, and for the 20 years from 2020 to 2040. So let's say we do make some adjustments that we can, you know, boost that, you know, what we had the past 20 years, and going, you know, we bump up to like that 250 to, like, let's say 300 or 350. There's still, you know, a gap. So that, like, I think people need to have an expectation that no matter where we end up with whatever we change, we're still working at a marginal rate. Like, we're not solving affordable housing. We're not, like, I don't know how much necessarily it will be felt in the community. I mean, certainly it could be depending on, how many units are coming in, but when you look at the per year units, change when the next ordinance goes live potentially, there needs to be, the public needs to know that, there's only so much you can do, either way, depending on what we're doing with the ordinance. So people need to understand, I think, the scale and scope, because I think, going back to Joe, you're talking about missing middle, people think, oh, this is going to all happen. You got to really message what is the scale, and then people need to know that, because they think affordable housing ordinance, oh no, like, oh, it's going to be like crazy, or like people on both sides will be like, oh, this is going to be so much, and then be disappointed, or people will say it's nothing, and then be like, oh no, So I think we need to like level set with the community on really what the scale and scope is of what we're changing.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and it goes to Joe's point as well, right? Being clear about what this is, tempering expectations is really important. First, I think we have to recognize that it's basically impossible for everyone to come away happy. There's a saying that, you've got a good negotiation when both parties leave and no one's completely satisfied. But I think it's particularly true here, where we to your point, Jason, there is a significant dearth in housing, and this is not going to solve that problem, right? And I think we have to be clear and honest about what a potential outcome from this will look like, right? I think any more affordable housing, any more caps is good, right? Like, anything above what we're already getting, both into AHIF and additional caps, is a plus, right? So I think we should be satisfied with that outcome, while at the same time admitting that it isn't going to fix like an affordable housing problem. But we've been talking about kind of like proximate causes, right? What kind of set off a chain of events to get people to a point back in 2005 where you had the critical mass to do this process in the beginning. And I think it would be difficult to say exactly when that moment happened here for us now, but I know for myself and a few others who I've spoken to in the community, what we saw with the Hotel Pentagon plan, right, for them was kind of like a moment. And I think we have an opportunity to increase the county's negotiation position, right, to get more caps, to get more AHIF contributions. Now, to your point, Jason, will this fix everything? No, right? And we should be clear about that. At the same time, I think we are doing something good here. Eric, yeah, I see you still have your hand up.
Sorry, that was a mistake.
Oh, no problem. Let's see, so we can keep on schedule. If no one else has their hand up, I'd like to move on to the next agenda item, which is understanding the site plan process. So, Russell, if you wouldn't mind.
So Anthony Fusarelli, the Director of Planning at CPHD, is going to provide the background on the site plan process. And this is important because the Affordable Housing Ordinance really lives and sits within the site plan development process. So I'll pass it over to Anthony.
All right, thank you, Russell, and thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. So good to see a number of familiar faces and names on the call. And as I'm bringing up my slides momentarily, so really appreciate the invitation to be here tonight and talk a little bit about the site. We'll talk a lot about the site plan process in the allotted time, but before we do that, did want to provide a broader framing for planning in Arlington more holistically, because everything that Arlington County is able to achieve and everything that we pursue through the site plan process is built upon a strong foundation of Arlington's comprehensive plan, its supporting area and sector plans, and many other planning and policy and regulatory components. And so with that, for those of you for whom this will be somewhat familiar territory, appreciate and thank you for your patience in advance, and really looking forward to an opportunity for some Q&A afterwards as well to cover anything that I might not address up front. This slide just shows an overview essentially of the key components that we'll be covering in the next few moments. And so really a background primer on the comprehensive plan, covering the supporting plans and documents that are separate from but relate to and reinforce the comprehensive plan itself, talking a little bit about implementation, and talking much more about the special exception site plan process as a key component of implementing Arlington's comprehensive plan. And so in Arlington, the planning and zoning framework that collectively guides our growth and development includes numerous plans, ordinances, regulatory and policy documents that generally fall into 5 main categories, at least for purposes of this conceptual diagram you see here. And so the way this is laid out, it's done so intentionally so that at the top, with the broadest band being the comprehensive plan and the narrow point at the bottom being the zoning ordinance and other codes, if you think about it, across a spectrum, that the comprehensive plan really is Arlington's, it's one of Arlington's most fundamental and important vision documents overall, but it needs many other components in order to actually realize that vision. And so the general land use plan itself is one of 12 elements of the comprehensive plan. In the planning division, we probably hold that nearest and dearest to our hearts, but I know my colleagues in Russell and Alex would say the same thing about the Affordable Housing Master Plan. The sector and area plans really take us to that next level of detail and vision to help implement public and private improvements. And then the capital improvement plan, the zoning ordinance, and the site plan process all play particular roles, which we'll talk a little bit more about on the next few slides. But by way of background, the Code of Virginia requires all localities in the Commonwealth to have an adopted comprehensive plan. Theoretically, it should be based on careful study of existing conditions and trends of growth, and also of probable future requirements of its land and its populations. For Arlington, it's one of the most important decision-making and priority-setting tools that is used by the county board, the planning commission, many other advisory commissions, and county staff. And it's also looked to, as we know, by many in the community. Overall, its intent is to guide coordinated development that really sets high standards of public services and facilities in Arlington. And in our exhibit we see here, we can see that the Arlington's vision statement is really at the core of this plan. We also know and understand that the comp plan should be general in nature. It was first established in 1960 with 5 elements. It has since grown over the decades to now include 12 elements, including the Affordable Housing Master Plan that was adopted a decade ago. Our department, Community Planning, Housing, and Development, is responsible for the overall coordination. However, many other departments across the county are responsible for their own respective elements, the administration thereof, and the updates as they come forward. And the Virginia Code also requires that at least once every 5 years, the Planning Commission review the comp plan to consider whether it would be appropriate to amend it. In the arena of land use, the General Land Use Plan is essentially the primary policy guide for future development across all of Arlington. It establishes the overall character, extent, and location of land uses, and it communicates this as a policy from the county board to the community, to residents, to the development community, and others. So those of you who are familiar with the general land use plan know that it has a variety of land use designations, each with their own respective range of densities, the typical uses that are then sort of portrayed for respective sites in Arlington. It also has, over the years, taken on a number of special districts that each have their own detailed goals and objectives associated with specific tools for implementation. Some of those are focused around affordable housing. Some of those are focused around revitalization and redevelopment of some of Arlington's older commercial cores, such as Roslyn, Crystal City in particular. And then in terms of amending the general land use plan, there are two primary ways in which this is done. It's either done as part of or following a long-range planning process led by the county. Could be a sector plan, could be an area plan, it could be the missing middle housing study. Additionally, or alternatively, individual landowners or contract purchasers of particular sites could also request the county board to change the land use designation for their property. So I mentioned earlier that while not part of the comprehensive plan itself, Arlington does have a large catalog of various area plans, sector plans, revitalization plans that do drill down to that next level of detail, provide that additional precision and refinement in setting the vision for many of Arlington's specific neighborhoods, along with the planning and urban design framework, setting the expectations and the vision for the type of development the county would like to see at the locations it would like to see that development, and then also the corresponding public improvements. Are there opportunities or places to create new parks, to expand the street grid, and to accomplish other public goals? And so these are all listed here. This is not an exhaustive list, but it is hopefully illustrative of the years and decades of planning work that have gone into defining more complete visions for specific areas. And I won't belabor the point. Many of you are probably already familiar with various sector plans or area plans themselves, but we see at a glance here the types of elements that each of these plans include to help inform the community review, the staff review, county board decision making on development proposals that we hope the development team and the applicant team has taken into consideration. And something that's very important to us, and we're continuing to work over time to better integrate, but is really building upon the county board's equity resolution from 2019 into our daily work and yearly work program for our planning division. And so that informs the specific projects, the types of work that we would prioritize. This year, looking at the definition of family within the zoning ordinance is one example of something we've been wanting to get to, and I think it intersects well with our equity goals and objectives today. But then how we do our work, conducting equity analyses with our studies when appropriate and feasible. In the site plan development arena, negotiating community benefits, that we review and think about, how can specific benefits help progress us to where we want to go as it relates to our equity objectives. And then the engagement, both through the site plan review process, the long range planning process, and then working with our partners elsewhere in the county on data and data resource and analysis tools. So that was a brief framing of the comprehensive plan and the supporting sector plan arenas. Just really quickly wanted to touch upon, other important pieces to implementing the comp plan. And we see those here by way of the CIP, the zoning ordinance itself, and then we'll spend the rest of our time together talking about incentive zoning and special exceptions. Again, trust that many of you, if not all, are very familiar with the capital improvement plan. But this is really an important method of implementing the comprehensive plan and its public components. It's the infrastructure, the transportation, the public spaces, the transit, etc. In practice, many, although not all, for sure, of the elements that ultimately are included in the CIP do have their origins in sector and area plans. And so there is a pretty strong connection and relationship there. And so now segueing a little bit into more of the zoning implementation and the site plan domain, Arlington's zoning ordinance has two principal means of land development. And so that's by right development and then the special exception, which with special exception, we often are referring to site plans, but we also have use permit developments. There's form-based code provisions and tools along Columbia Pike. Very rarely do we use proffered zoning, and we haven't for several decades. But for tonight's discussion, really want to largely focus on the connection between the zoning ordinance and special exception site plans. Also, while acknowledging many other codes, the subdivision ordinance, Chest Bay, building code, fire code, and others all come into play in many occasions. But so what exactly is a special exception site plan? And so simply stated, it is Arlington's primary tool for implementing the general land use plan and our higher density and medium density development in areas of Arlington calling for such growth. In Arlington, it's a well-founded planning and zoning tool. It goes back to the early 1960s. And an important piece of it is it permits modifications of regulations that are currently in the zoning ordinance. So it gives developers flexibility to shape, design, and build their projects differently than if they just had to follow the by right requirements. But in exchange for that, there's a public process and there's a public review that ultimately culminates in county board approval, where every site plan needs at least a majority vote of the county board in order to be approved and gain its entitlement. The areas of flexibility we typically see, they might have to do with parking, building height, setbacks, lot coverage, and certainly other parameters not noted here are all things that the county board does have the authority to modify should they find that a proposed site plan is appropriate for a particular location. A big part of also that decision to approve a site plan is an understanding or a conclusion that the impacts of the project are rightfully mitigated. And we'll talk more about that shortly. In terms of our use of the site plan process, it really is predicated and grounded in the incentive zoning authority we have, again, from the Code of Virginia, given our county manager form of government. And so as reflected in the Virginia Code, incentive zoning involves the use of bonuses, essentially in the form of more density or other benefits to a developer, in return for a developer and their project providing certain features, design elements, uses, services, or amenities desired by the locality. And oftentimes, we'll be looking for, does a project provide the things that the sector plan or the area plan envisions for it, or perhaps directly elements of our comprehensive plan may be calling for as well. Examples of these could include specific character of site design or neighborhood development, environmentally and energy efficient building design and development, affordable housing, certainly a focus of this group, but historic preservation and others as well. And so that's all strict language directly pulled from the Code of Virginia itself. So when we talk about the board's authority to approve a site plan and in staff's review of a site plan proposal, our zoning ordinance sets forth the criteria that should be used by the board and in staff's review in arriving at a conclusion that a site plan should be approved. So these findings are listed here on this slide. They're essentially that the project substantially complies with the character of approved master plans, area plans, and uses permitted for a site, functionally relates to other structures in the district, will not be detrimental to those in the neighborhood or surroundings, and is also designed and located to promote and protect public health, safety, and welfare. And then also the Code of Virginia and the zoning allows the county board to establish conditions of approval. Any one of you who have been involved in the site plan review process or part of that understanding know that we have today dozens of standard site plan conditions that attach to a typical site plan. And then oftentimes there's additional specific standards added based on the unique conditions of that site or the project itself. Did want to talk briefly here about the difference between standard site plan densities and additional density, because this is, especially in the past 5 or 6 years, but even longer, this is an important arena or context to understand the county's ability to negotiate additional benefits such as affordable housing, such as transportation investments or community facilities investments, really depends on how much additional density is being requested or proposed above the stated maximums in the general land use plan. And so site plans may propose developments up to the standard site plan densities that are listed on the general land use plan. And in that instance, if they're only seeking the maximums on the general land use plan, the typical expectation is they need to comply with all standard site plan conditions. And I know later on this evening, Russell will be going into more detail on how the affordable housing ordinance sort of intersects with this. So I'll skip over that here. But in many instances, and is more often the case, we are seeing site plan applications proposing additional density when the site conditions and the applicable planning guidance would accommodate it. So if an area plan says the site can go to 16 stories and additional density could be fit within that 16 stories, then that's something that we would review and quite possibly find draw a positive conclusion or get to an area of support. The portions of the zoning ordinance that speak to additional building height and density above the general land use plan is really embedded in 1559 of the zoning ordinance. And so these are the 5 category of elements that for which additional height and density could be proposed: affordable housing, community facilities, sustainable design, and that's really implemented through the county's green building incentive program. As of last November, we now have adaptive reuse, which is really directed at implementing and supporting the board's recent policy on the conversion of obsolete office buildings, and then also other public priorities. And so there's a little bit of space and flexibility there for things beyond that for which additional density or height could be approved. Not going to belabor on this point, but again, just reinforcing that conditions of approval are a very important part of a site plan. All conditions need to be met. Our colleagues in zoning track the implementation and fulfillment of the conditions throughout the permitting and design and development process, and all leading up to hopefully a successful issuance of a master certificate of occupancy for a development project. And so just conceptually, this slide is, I think, a visual way to sort of compare the relative potential density, but then also the features and amenities expected at various development rates. So with a by right project, very little density potential, but also no county board action. And these are administratively approved, and they do not have standard conditions that they apply with other than those set forth in applicable ordinances and codes. The middle column really speaks to, in a high office apartment hotel situation, 4.8 FAR. These are examples of the types of features and amenities provided through a site plan without bonus density. And you can see, a mid-rise building here with some public space. But then conceptually to the right, for those projects that are seeking additional density, that's where we get to negotiate additional affordable housing, oftentimes by way of in-kind units, but some either on-site or off-site, but also sometimes just larger contributions to AHIF. That's where we reach agreement on sustainable design. There can be community facilities provided or other features, oftentimes transportation improvements, public space improvements above the base are a big part of that. And just to make this a little bit more real, just a couple project examples here. So for Metropolitan Park, which is Amazon's first phase of their Arlington headquarters, you can see conceptually the building massing and program to the left. The middle column under standard amenities, those are all things that would have been expected up to the standard levels of density per the general land use plan, given the site area for that property. And then to the right, we see the amenities associated with their request for additional density. And so they went up to LEED Platinum. They provided an additional $12.5 million to AHIF on top of a $7.5 million base, and then major improvements to the public space that was recreated centrally within the block, and then offsite transportation improvements. And then one final example with the Key in Roslyn. Similarly, I won't go through all of it, but just a breakdown between what was the standard improvements up to the general land use plan density limits, the additional or extraordinary contributions for that additional density above 4.8, in this case, going to all the way to about 10 FAR. And a lot of this is connected back to the site-specific recommendations that we might have in our sector plan, in this particular instance for Roslyn. And so that about wraps it up. The last two slides I just wanted to note, because many of you are involved in the site plan review process. But these are borrowed from a one-pager that we have. But it just really speaks to, as we pull together community representatives to work with the Planning Commission in reviewing site plan proposals, we're doing so through a variety of lenses, looking at various topic areas and elements of a project and potential impacts. You can see those here. And then in terms of the process itself, again, these site plans are major development projects. We understand they will be with us if they get approved and built. They will be with us for decades. And so we want to ensure that they're reviewed appropriately and thoroughly, but also efficiently. And so community engagement is a key part of that. Our SPRC process and meetings are also important, and then leading up to commission, board, and review. So with that, Brian, I will wrap there. Thank you for the time, and happy to address any questions. See,
Yeah. I have one, Anthony, very good job. After going, I'm in North Roslyn here. After going through many site plans, this PowerPoint was outstanding. I now, this is extremely helpful. So thank you. One quick question. How many right developments, what is the percentage of right developments, by right developments?
First of all, Joe, thank you for that feedback. Appreciate that, and glad this was helpful. So I don't have a specific number off the top of my head. I will say this:
is it the exception rather than the rule? I mean,
It is. I would say. I mean, certainly where we see by right development in Arlington are the single family development, right? So for the 1-for-1 replacement, typically, because we have very few remaining vacant lots.
Yeah.
But 1-for-1 development will be almost always by right. We do have some multifamily zoning districts like RA 615. You know, there have been some recent developments, I would say, in your neck of the woods, between like Arlington Boulevard and Joint Base. The longstanding zoning in that area has led to some mid-rise development that has happened by right with, you know, multifamily residential. So that, you know, it does happen. I won't say it doesn't, but particularly in our transit corridors, so anywhere within the Roslyn-Ballston corridor, and the closer you get to transit, the more likely you're going to see the site plan development, as well as along Route 1, and hopefully more so, you know, along Langston Boulevard. But that's not a specific quantitative answer, but hopefully it's qualitative and helpful. Kellen, I see you have your hand raised.
Thank you. Appreciate that presentation, Anthony. It was very helpful. If you're able to post that on the website or send it out, that would be super helpful as well. I'm trying to understand better the scope of the site plan conditions and negotiations that the county can engage in and where that authority comes from. So I know you said that part of it is based off of our form of government, but it also sounds like the county board has a pretty large degree of latitude in deciding here are the types of things that we're going to ask for as part of site plan negotiations, or even like the standard site plan. So part of what I'm a little confused on is, why is it that the county was able to ask Amazon to have a school housed as part of their development, or for the project in Roslyn, they were able to say, give millions of dollars to this park that's nearby, but yet in 2005, they couldn't ask for affordable housing. So why is it that these types of things are okay for the county to ask for, but affordable housing was something they had to go to the state to get special permission to ask for or negotiate for?
Yeah, no, Kellen, thank you. We will certainly, I'll work with Alex and Russell to make sure we can get the presentation posted. I'm happy to do so. I mean, in terms of your question, I don't know that I could address it fully in terms of the reasons why, especially going back to 2005. It was a little before my time. But what I will say, right, is that the zoning ordinance in particular, and the provisions within 1559 that I shared, you know, do spell out the types of things. So you asked, you know, for example, to take your example on Penn Place, right? The inclusion of a school, incorporating the Arlington Community High School as part of the Penn Place development, it's based upon an earlier approval of the Pentagon City phase development site plan that called for a 20,000 square foot community facility as part of the future build out of that project. But it's also enabled or allowed for through 1559 in the zoning ordinance, because that school essentially qualifies as a community facilities. And, you know, today in 2025, affordable housing is also spelled out in 1559. And so that's why today, with a project like Met Park, right, Arlington was able to negotiate through that site plan a, you know, significant increase above the base AHIF contribution in relation to the additional density that was being required. And I guess your question, or maybe your point, is that in 2005, you know, we wouldn't have the same authority to have done that then. I think it, you know, it in some ways boils down to the provisions we currently have, both within the Code of Virginia and within the zoning ordinance, you know, provide us that ability today. So hopefully that helps address your question.
somewhat. Is 1559 a reflection of state code? Like, is it basically mirroring that, or how much latitude does the county board have to go into 1559 and add additional things if they would like to?
No, that's a good question. I wouldn't say that it mirrors it, but there's certainly alignment and some commonalities. I think one of the other aspects or perspectives here is that there needs to be, for any site plan that is undergoing our review leading up to county board approval, most of our negotiations, or most of what we work with developers trying to achieve through these projects, are focused on transportation improvements. They're focused on public space. It's focused on affordable housing, other tangible things or contributions with a direct nexus to the development. And so, that there's not necessarily a fine line in terms of determining what that means exactly, but it is the boundaries within we're working. The county and the board cannot request things that don't have sort of an appropriate and defensible nexus, and that's that provides some additional boundaries around what we are typically discussing as part of these projects.
Anthony, do you mind if I jump in and just add a little bit of context to your very helpful answer? And Kellen, really good questions. I think just 15.5.9 is tied to the state code provision, particularly Section D, which allows Arlington in its ordinance to account for asking for additional affordable housing contributions and things like that if you're seeking bonus density. And I think maybe a practical reason why you saw such significant community benefits contributions for the Amazon project and also for the Roslyn project is because keep in mind they're seeking bonus density, an enormous amount of bonus density, right? I think in both Amazon's case and the project in Roslyn's case, the maximum FAR under the GLUP for both is 4.8 FAR, and I think they sought 10.0 FAR or more. So there's a huge amount of bonus density they were seeking, which means they had to contribute more in the way of community benefits. So I think that's part of the reason why they probably had those additional things like schools, which, as Anthony mentioned, oftentimes in Roslyn in particular, they say, here's the community benefits we think would be we would want in exchange for bonus density. So you're kind of fulfilling the vision of the sector plan when you're coming forward and proposing those.
No, thanks, Matt. Appreciate you sharing that as well. Michelle.
Hello. My question kind of goes back to one of your very first slides where you said that we don't use proffered zoning, and that triggered my question, which is, and tell me, Brian and others, tell me if this is going to be covered in another meeting, but can you talk about the differences between what we do and are allowed to do compared to what other jurisdictions are allowed to do? Because I know at some point we do intend to do some comparisons, but there's a lot of differences in the regulatory framework.
Yeah, Michelle, that's a great question. I unfortunately, I don't think can address it head on this evening. Part of it is just because I think it's been over 20 years since we've really had the last proffered rezoning that I'm familiar with. Colleagues of mine who certainly have experience in other jurisdictions here in Northern Virginia could be a resource to potentially follow up with additional information if that would be helpful. I would say, that conversation has come up. I know every so often amongst the board or others in the community, and suggesting or asking the question of, is there a more perhaps productive way or more effective way to manage growth in comparison to community benefits? I think, not having been sort of directly engaged in all of those conversations, I can only, share that we've continued to follow, the system or the process that we have here in Arlington, But certainly happy to call on others in the future if that would be helpful to get more information for you on that.
And yeah, just to hop in and kind of also add some context there, Michelle, to your point, we will be going to more depth on comparing where we stand vis-a-vis Fairfax and Alexandria regarding their processes and their affordable housing ordinances. So that is something we are going to cover, but that's a great question.
Thanks, Brian.
Alice.
Good evening, everyone. Anthony, thank you. That was a great presentation. And as others, I'll echo, getting it online maybe in a couple different places would be great. And I just mentioned, because of that, I've been thinking more about, you know, the development process that happens in neighborhoods and the pushback that we're getting. And I think one of the things was a little bit mentioned, maybe even by Joe, about, you know, affordable housing stories and highlighting what we have in the county, that people don't have a lot of understanding of the process. It is confusing. It's long. Who's involved? Who makes which choice? There's so much to it that I really think it might be helpful if the county could create something that would help at the beginning of public meetings. I talked to Richard and maybe we'll try to figure something out. But my idea was like maybe a 5-minute video that might include like all those slides, really, just to get everyone level set. Okay, this is what we can and cannot ask of a developer. We're in the category where we can ask these types of things. This is how it'll play out. This is how many SPRCs we may or may not have, like all those kind of basics to get people where they are, because you're hearing them saying like, oh, well, the county says it wants affordable housing. Why didn't they make, you know, Hotel Pentagon 531 units of affordable housing? You know, basic stuff that folks aren't understanding. We can't just dictate, you know, but what can we negotiate? What can we get? So I just put that out as a seed to be thinking about where could we up our public education around these complicated processes. And then maybe people would, you know, feel more part of the process, understand it better. You know, I'm not saying they won't oppose, but they might at least feel a part of and get a grasp. So I'm just throwing that out there early. The other two, I had a quick question. The CIP does not include any housing component. Is that right?
Yeah, I would. I mean, my understanding is, actually, I might ask Russell, as perhaps an expert on the housing side, to be able to speak to where AHIF, you know, resides as it relates to the CIP or just other budgetary documents, and then also beyond AHIF, I guess, if there's anywhere else or any other way in which housing would show up in the CIP. Thanks, Russell.
Yeah. So yeah, AHIF is apart and separate from the capital improvement plan funds, which are funded through general obligation bonds usually, and those are for public improvements that are owned by the county. In the case of housing, the county does not own or operate housing, so we really don't have it. It's not appropriate. Where, you know, in the future, perhaps sometimes if there were a public facility where housing was a component of the redevelopment of a public facility, it might be appropriate to work with the capital improvement plan to see how that, if it's possible to finance that jointly through that. But at present, no, the capital improvement plan and the budgeting for that is entirely separate, really, from our AHIF funding.
Okay, that's what I thought. And I just wondered, because we've always talked about housing bonds and where, if we ever got one, would it come into play in a CIP process? But I guess that's only the case if it were co-housing with other things, but co-location. So my last one is very quick. I just, again, back to trying to bring people into the process and understand how things work. It also got me thinking about this negotiation process that you're talking about in the presentation and how that's a little bit opaque for people. Like, what are the things that could be asked for? What are the things that cannot be asked for? How does the county staff or board prioritize the things that they could ask for? And why are we asking for more of this and not more of that? I think there's a lot of questions about that in the community. I know that's a little bit off topic, but I just thought I'd bring it up in the context of this discussion of negotiations, that people don't quite understand how that process works and how we get to the result that is sort of a staff recommendation at the end. So not really a question, just a comment.
No, Alice, thanks. I appreciate that, and I think it's a comment that we've heard before, and I think there's there's reasons for, I think, or why we understand that perception is out there. I would say that at a very high level, right, our general approach, the macro approach to the negotiations, is always going to be, or nearly almost always going to be, embedded or based upon, goals and objectives set forth in our plans, right? And then specifically how the details shake out as part of that, I understand and appreciate people may not know until going into the Planning Commission or County Board hearing, but separately, I do want to just circle back to your suggestion earlier. I think 5 minutes, like a 5-minute video, might be quite ambitious to cover everything that needs to be covered. I will say, though, our team has been having ongoing conversations with leadership in the Planning Commission to this year to stand up or to host really like an SPRC 101 sort of like primer or public meeting where all would be invited. We would host it in person, but also through Teams, so it could be a recording and it could live on in posterity and really be a resource. People may need to, commit more than 5 minutes to understand, but maybe there's a Cliff Notes version that we can sort of pull together from that as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Sounds great.
And thank you. Unfortunately, we will have to move on from this topic because we are a bit behind, and there's actually another agenda item on top of the ones we have formally listed that I'd like to get to. So I want to thank Anthony so much for his very informative presentation, demystifying a lot of this process, because to Alice's point, this is a somewhat wonky and heady concept to kind of get your head around. So breaking it down kind of step by step and explaining it to folks is really, I think, important. And I would appreciate as well if we could get some sort of kind of like Cliff Notes version, right? Like a zoning code for dummies, if you will, to help folks kind of understand all the technicalities of this. So thanks again.
All right. No, thanks for having me, and look forward to, we're available and around to be a further resource if that's helpful as you all proceed on your journey. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So quickly, I want to move on to Matt, just so we can hear some of his insights from an applicant's perspective on the 4.1 process, since recently went through it, I believe, with the 3033 Wilson Boulevard plan.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Please take it away.
Thanks, Brian. I'll be really fast. Again, everyone, my name is Matt Weinstein. I'm a land use attorney in McGuire Woods, also a member of the working group. I'm here on behalf of NAOP, which is the Commercial Real Estate Developers Association. So I just want to give you just very high level overview of how we, the applicant side views the 4.1 process. Obviously not speaking for any particular developer, just giving you general feedback that I've seen over the years. I think the first comment I want to make is that, I often get requests from developers who are looking to maybe buy a property, or they own a property, they figure out what they want to do. And they do not take the 4.1 process lightly. It is a serious leap of faith to go through the process because it's a discretionary approval. There's a fair amount of risk involved about how the project's going to come out at the end of the day. So it is something that developers look at very closely on the front end when they're doing diligence. And the diligence process, in many ways, is a math problem, right? They have many developers have institutional investors who demand a rate of return, a guaranteed rate of return on their project. They have contractors, they have consultants, they have carrying costs, they have taxes. It's all lumped into really how much is it going to cost to get through the entitlement process and get this built and up and running. So, I think the way developers and people I've worked with view the 4.1 process is there is some certainty in the process in that if you go through it, typically everyone feels like they more or less had their voice heard and there's some consensus around it. Not everyone's going to be happy, but you're not going to be like DC where projects get sued and appealed and you're tied up in court for years. And then there's some things that are certain, like the standard site plan conditions and the base contributions, like the public art contribution, TDM, transportation demand management studies, things like that. Like, how much those are going to cost. And relevant for this working group, how much the AHIF contribution is going to cost for the base contribution, because it's a formula you can do with very easy math. You figure out what's the FAR I'm going for, and how much am I going to have to pay to AHIF. So the predictability for that, beyond just what the actual number is huge. That's one thing the developers really appreciate, is knowing very early on how much the AHIF contribution is going to be if they elect to do that for the base contribution. And if you're going for bonus density, which typically most projects, I should say historically most projects have, because the maximum FAR in the GLUP is a little lower than I think what most projects can be developed at. Historically, it's a little bit different now in this current economy. So you would go for bonus density. And that's where the uncertainty comes in, right? Because it's a negotiation with the county. And the way it's done, generally, this depends on every single case, is you figure out what the assessed value of the bonus density is, meaning how many square feet are you looking to get in bonus density, get the assessed value of that, and you have a rough idea of what the community benefits will cost, and then you figure out how you're going to spend that community benefits money, whether it's going to be affordable housing, whether it's going to be offsite infrastructure improvements, a new park, a new school, a new library, whatever it may be, right? But you don't know that going into the until you file your 4.1 and start working through the process. So that's a huge amount of uncertainty on the applicant side that people know they're going to experience, but it is a bit risky because assessment values change all the time. County priorities can change occasionally in terms of what's more of a priority than any other priorities. But I will say right now, like, I think people generally understand that the main priority, if you're going for bonus density, are on-site CAFs. Like, people understand that's generally the main thing, but you're also kind of bound by the sector plan recommendations. If the sector plan says you need to have a new park next to your building, you're going to be expected to put in a new park. Or if you're expected to put in a new street segment, you're going to have to put in a new street segment, right? So it really does vary by the sector plan guidance and all of that. So, the community benefits process, the bonus density process, there is a bit of uncertainty, with the exception of the green building incentive policy, where if you meet certain criteria, you can bank bonus density of 0.25 FAR, 0.35, so on and so forth, depending on what your level LEED certification is. So, but that's getting more expensive too. So this is all to say that there's a mixture of certainty and uncertainty in the process, and developers generally like more certainty, which is why they like the AF contribution for the base contribution. And I think in general, developers understand and appreciate that they're going to be neighbors in their community for a long time. They want to make sure their projects fit in with the community and meet county goals. But some of the uncertainty that you all feel on your side, we feel on our side too, about how a project's going to come out. But we do think that if a project works out well, it generally means that the developer generally gets the project they wanted, the community is heard, and they get some change of the project based on their feedback, staff's priorities are met, and everyone gets a little bit something out of the process, and at the end of the day, they're more or less happy with it. And I think, again, finally, it's a math problem and it's a timing problem. So it's figuring that out, it takes a lot of work, and it's a bit of a leap of faith, but it's all to say that, I think this process has been going on for a long time, and people know more or less what to expect, but built in the system is a fair amount of uncertainty.
Okay. And I see Mary has her hand up. I just want to ask two quick questions that are related to one another. One, you've made, I think, a very salient point that developers like certainty, right? And so as we look at this process, my questions are: one, do you think amending the provision regarding the amount of AHIP contributions to, say, a higher rate would affect that perception of certainty in any way, right? And the second, it's somewhat related, but not on top of that one, is from your perspective, what would be some ways to increase certainty that are within the scope of what we're doing here as a part of the ordinance working group's work?
The first question, of course, I can't, predict exactly how NAOP or the developers would feel about it. But, again, it goes back to my earlier point. It's a math problem, right? So if you're increasing the AHIF contribution, base AHIF contribution, there are other pieces of the pie that probably will need to get shrunk down in some way, right? So if you're increasing the AHIF pie, then other parts of the process that involve monetary contributions might have to offset that, right? So like it's prioritizing, because again, it's they have to make sure that a project pencils out, which is a way of saying that your pro forma's work and the project can be profitable for investors and for the developer. And if you're just increasing the AF contribution without offsetting anything else, that might be difficult. And then what was the second question? I forget.
Second question is somewhat related, which is, what are ways, in your opinion, that we could attempt to kind of balance those elements? I think you kind of fleshed out my second question a bit more. So I appreciate that. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of the second question.
Yeah, I mean, just think, again, the bonus density process is fairly uncertain, and you don't know exactly what you're going to be providing and how much credit you'll get in terms of bonus density. So maybe having some parameters on that end could be helpful, just so generally people know if you provide X number of caps, it can mean this amount of bonus density square footage. But that's all related to the fact this is a negotiation, right? So, I mean, other things I was thinking of is, Anthony mentioned in some circumstances, additional AF contributions have been used to provide to get bonus density. I think there are a couple of Crystal City projects where that was the case, but making maybe that more common, right? Like you have the formula, but if you go above that by a certain percentage, then you can get bonus density of blah, 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 right? That could be a way. Then that people will know, well, if I donate the base contribution's $1 million, if I contribute 2, that means I can get an additional 1.5 FAR or something, right? I think that'd be appreciated.
Thank you. Mary.
Thanks, Matt, for giving us the other side of the coin. I think that's really important. My question is a little bit like Michelle's question about proffers. And I know you worked in other jurisdictions. So is the uncertainty in the 4.1 process greater than the uncertainty that a developer might experience going through Fairfax's process or Loudoun's process?
Yeah, so I don't work as much in those jurisdictions, but I have colleagues who do. And my sense, and certainly don't hold me to this, but I think in those jurisdictions, it's different. So just for everyone's benefit, a proffer is the developer offers to provide certain benefits for the project, right? The locality doesn't ask for them, where for Arlington, the site plan conditions are viewed as development conditions. So they're kind of seen as ways to mitigate the development, right? So it's different than the developer offering to make certain proffers. But I think my sense is that in other jurisdictions, it's kind of better understood what proffers are expected for that type of project. And just for everyone's benefit, the way I typically look at this, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues do too, is when I'm trying to figure out what community benefits might be expected in Arlington, you look at recent approvals, You look at staff reports to see how they are characterized and things like that. So that's kind of how you predict how it's going to look. And I think in Fairfax it's somewhat similar, but the proffer form is a little more predictable, I think.
Thanks. I think predictability could be it can either be a red herring or it can be something that you spend a lot of time trying to address. And I guess the question I have is, does it really, in the end, if you look at the dollar amount, does it make a lot of difference? And is it just an anxiety producing thing? So Brian, that's a topic I'm somewhat interested in as we think about what changes we might make.
Right. And I just for my own clarification, maybe I have this backwards, but it was always my assumption that if you compared impact fees, or in certain parlance, they're called limited exactions versus proffers, that impact fees are typically seen as less opaque, right? The process behind those are a bit more clear cut, right? We look at whatever the impact of a certain development is, and then we base out the community benefits based on that versus a proffer. But you're saying that the proffer is more conducive to certainty. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, don't hold me to it because I mostly work in Arlington, a little bit in Falls Church. And in Falls Church, they use what are called voluntary concessions, which is a great term for this. I can certainly talk to some of my Fairfax colleagues. A couple of my bosses do Fairfax work and get back to you. But I think my understanding is that there's there are proffer forms that is generally expected for that project. So you kind of come forward with what other projects have done and all of that, where Arlington, it's truly a negotiation once you're typically in SPRC. Like you're well into the process and you start negotiating what those community benefits are going to be.
Yeah. We got two questions. First, Joe had his hand first.
Yeah, and Matt, can you discuss transfer development rights and how useful that is, et cetera?
Yeah, so in my prior firm, Bean Kinney, they did one of these projects. I think it was Wakefield Gardens. That was the sending site, and then the receiving site was what is now the Wendy, if I remember correctly. So, and actually the Insight project in Boston used them as well. So the challenge there is that you have to have a sending site that's going to send its density and basically covenant that it's not going to develop up to the density allowed in the sector plan for that area. They send their density to a receiving site, which can then use it for bonus density or additional density. The challenge is where I've seen it happen. Usually the owner of the sending site is the same as the owner of the receiving site because it cuts down on negotiations and it's easier to do that. And there's no I've heard people talk about the TDR bank. So like people can put up a listing when they're willing to sell their density and all that, but we don't have anything like that. So it's really, really hard to know which property owners might be interested in selling their density and all of that. So it's not common, and it's usually
more useful if it's kind of prearranged where.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. But it achieves affordable housing in this, but just not in that location.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Eric.
Yeah, not a question. Just I agree with Mary's comment at the end about predictability and kind of teasing that out a little bit and kind of pushing on that a little bit. I think that's something I concur with Mary. I think that's something to continue thinking about in this group.
All right, thank you. I'd like to move on a bit because we're again a little bit behind a lot of questions. I know this is a really interesting topic. We're getting much more into details on this, but just so that I can have everyone out in a fashionable amount of time, I'd like to proceed with our last point. So thank you, Matt, very much for your perspective and giving us that detailed explanation on a number of topics related to the applicant perspective through this. All right, so lastly, we'll be going into a little bit of explanation on the Affordable Housing Ordinance, what it is, how it works, and results up to date. So with that, I will turn it over to Russell to give us a brief summary.
Yes, so this group is convened specifically to look at the Affordable Housing Ordinance. And so finally, after all this time, we're here. But really appreciated Anthony's presentation. I think it's really important to understand that the Affordable Housing Ordinance lives and is situated within the site plan process. And so, hang on, what's going on here? Okay, so I'm going to go through the ordinance with you all tonight so we all have a clear understanding of what it actually is. There's several components to it. The base ordinance, which is most commonly what is referred to as the ordinance, but there's other provisions in the ordinance as well that are really important not to forget that they're part of the ordinance, and that's replacement housing, GLUP amendments, and bonus density. So what is the Affordable Housing Ordinance? It's a section of the zoning ordinance, and it defines the affordable housing contributions that site plan developments are required actually to provide. It's codified in the Code of Virginia under section 15.2.753.1, which is the section for the county manager form of government. So this applies really in all of Virginia. This is only Arlington and unique to Arlington. In our zoning code, it is found primarily in section 15.5.8, and I know we sent ahead the whole chapter 15.5 for y'all, just so you understand the whole context of it. But 15.5.8 is really where the Affordable Housing Ordinance that lives, and then a small amount in 15.5.9. That's related to the bonus density. So what types of projects does this apply to? Well, we spent the first part of this meeting talking about special exception site plan projects, and that's really the only things that these apply to. And only site plan projects that exceed a floor area ratio of 1.0. And it applies to both residential and commercial uses, which is really great and perhaps unique to Arlington. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of the ordinance, I just want to cover some useful terms. Gross floor area, that according to our zoning ordinance as defined is the gross floor area. It's the sum of the area of horizontal surfaces of all the floors of a building measured from the exterior faces or exterior walls, and includes all floor area not defined as gross parking area. Now, floor area ratio gets a little bit more complicated. Floor area ratio is the gross floor area of all buildings on the lot divided by the lot area. Division, easy enough math. So if you have a 50,000 square foot lot and you've got a one-story 50,000 square foot building on that, would be one FAR. That could be in different geometries. You could be covering the half of that lot, 25,000 square feet, with 2 stories to get you to 50, which is the same as that lot, or you could have 4 and much more open space around that. Each story in that case, or the floor area, would be 12,500 times 4 would get you 50 to get you 1 FAR, etc. Up as you get to higher FARs, it's the you've got more density on the lot. You've got 2 stories covering the whole lot. That's 2 FARs, and same with the if you're using a fraction of the site area for the building, you get a taller building, but really the same FAR. So what types of projects are subject to the Affordable Housing Ordinance? I think I covered this before, but site plan projects where the floor area ratio exceeds 1.0, and for both residential and commercial uses. What site plan projects are not subject to the ordinance? Because you can have a site plan project that isn't subject to the ordinance, and those would be where it doesn't apply to the rehabilitation or renovation or adaptive reuse amendment. and for site plans containing less than 1.0 FAR. There's also a provision where the board, where there are competing public priorities, can actually waive all the requirements of the ordinance or all the requirements for affordable housing. That rarely, if ever, happens. So again, Anthony covered this, the different ways that you can build in Arlington by right, and then through site plan. Also, there's a use permit process, but the ordinance only applies to site plan. So 15.5.8.c, really what we often refer to as the base ordinance, defines the ways that a project can comply with the affordable housing requirements, either by providing units on site, and that's calculated by taking 5% of the floor area, gross floor area, above that first 1.0 FAR. Or another way to think about that is you're going to look at the whole building. If it's, and I have an example on the next slide. Better to wait for that. Or there's offsite nearby, which would increase the amount of floor area on that offsite by a factor of, like, you're looking at 1.5 times as much floor area. And then if it's offsite elsewhere in the county, really doubling that floor area, or a cash contribution. And so the means of compliance in the ordinance is entirely up to the developer. We'll talk more about that later. But to look at the math for this, let's look at a hypothetical site with a 50,000 square foot lot in a zoning district that allows up to 3.24 FAR by site plan. So in this case, they're just going up to that max that's allowed. They're not looking for bonus density. So to get that 3.24, the gross floor area would be 162,000 square feet, and the FAR, again, 3.24. So the first 50,000 square feet that's built of that 162,000 is exempt from the ordinance for the calculation of units. And then we take the remaining square footage, the 112,000 square foot, and multiply that by 0.05 or 5% to get 5,600 square foot. That would yield us 8 units based on an average unit size of 700 square feet per unit. Now, the average unit size is going to vary with each project, each building, because buildings are all different. But 700 just as a for this example here. So that's how that number of units. So board reports will always list these methods of compliance, even though only one method is needed for at the end of the day. So the Affordable Housing Ordinance, before I go on, this is in 15.5.8G, skipping ahead just because it's useful to know. We're talking about units affordable at 60% AMI and for a term of 30 years. So the cash contribution, which we all recognize as the method that developers by far favor, cash contributions are based on the amount of the building area up to the maximum floor area ratio in the corresponding zoning district. Anthony had a great slide where it showed that first FAR and then a tannish building above that, which was the next level, and then kind of a lighter thing above that. So we're looking at that middle area where they're only going up to what's allowed under the GLUP, and the applicable rates for that floor area, they're tiered and adjusted annually. It's adjusted based on the consumer price index for housing in the Washington, Baltimore metropolitan statistic area. And it's calculated based on the date that the site plan application is accepted. So not when the board approves it, but when that application comes into the county as an accepted by the the planning department. And then it is paid to the county upon issuance or prior to issuance of a certificate of occupancy. And so below is the rates, and the rate scales up as the FAR scales up. And one thing to consider, in the unit calculation, we're netting out that first FAR. In the cash contribution, we're including that first FAR. So the first FAR is at $2.44 a square foot, started at $1.50 back in 2005. And then the next two FARs from 1.0 to 3.0 goes up to $6.54. And you might remember from the discussion last month, that was set at $4 back in 2005. So it has increased. And then from FARs from 3 to 5 have a contribution rate of 13.11. So as Matt said, it's a math problem. I did want to point out, I did pull up the historical consumer price index for housing for the Baltimore, Washington statistical area. The first adjustment was in 2006 because the state codified this in 2006. So 7 was the first year that it was adjusted. And so since it began in 2006, it has actually increased a total of 64% over that amount of time. And that pretty much tracks with how rents have increased as well as, and some other factors, area median income also. It's pretty close. The Affordable Housing Ordinance. So how does that cash contribution actually get calculated? In an example, again, you've got your first floor area ratio. So the first 50,000 feet on this project times the going rate for that tier, which is $2.44, gets you 122,000. The next 1 to 3 floor area ratio is calculated at the next tier. So that's 1,000 square feet at $6.54 would get you $654,000. And then the density that's above 3.0 FAR is calculated at $13.11. There's, in this example, there's 12,000 additional square feet that falls under that, and that would be 157,320, and gets you a total of 933,320. So there's no rounding, no fidgeting with the numbers at all. It is what it is. So the option, there's the 4 options: on-site units, off-site units nearby, and off-sites far away, and the cash contribution. And so in this project, it could either be 8 units, 12 units, 16 units, or $933,320. The ordinance and the Code of Virginia are very clear on this, that it is the site plan applicant that selects the option for compliance. And the Code of Virginia says the applicant may elect to provide any one of these following contributions. So they both are clear in saying that it is not the county or any advisory boards, but the applicant who chooses how they will fulfill the ordinance. And the ordinance also has the process for that doesn't happen at the time that the board approves the project. It happens afterwards. So the board approves the project, and prior to the certificate of occupancy, the applicant will submit to the county manager their plan for meeting the affordable dwelling unit requirement. And the county manager then has 30 days to act on that request. There is a provision in the ordinance for deviations for off-site units. So if a developer said, I want to do off-site units, and it was calculated at X and I want to do Y, they have the option of coming back and saying, I want to do off-site units. They're at this place, but there's these conditions, and for these reasons, I want to do it differently than what was in the approved site plan conditions in the board report. And that would go to the Housing Commission, so to your body, for a review, and the Housing Commission would prepare a report to the county manager. To my knowledge, this has never been done. But the approval or rejection of that proposal would be an administrative approval. So the county manager could approve it without any public hearing or anything. The only public hearing would be that before the Housing Commission. But if the manager were to deny that, the applicant would have the option of seeking a site plan amendment and going back to the board to get that approved. Again, this is a special provision for if they want an alternative proposal for off-site affordable dwelling units. This has never happened. So as I mentioned earlier, the county board does have the option of waiving the requirements entirely for affordable housing if there are other competing or compelling public reasons. And some of those might be in site plans where there is very specific guidance about how a site should be developed and other public amenities. Again, this is really something that rarely, if ever, happens. I'm trying to come up with something in my mind and was looking through, and I can't find a recent example of where the board has waived this. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The general land use plan, which Anthony gave a good background on, that's defining the height. Oftentimes there's special GLUP studies or other that come before the board. And this section of the ordinance actually allows us to get additional affordable dwelling units through that process. And I want to look at the example. So recently, the Pershing Drive Special General Land Use Plan study went to the board. There was a section in there that talked about affordable housing, and I'll read what's on the slide here. So the additional affordable affordability would be achieved through on-site affordable units equivalent to 20% of the difference in the floor area between the maximum density under the existing general land use plan designation and the project's proposed density under the new general land use plan density. So this is an important component of the ordinance. We often get these projects that come in. The Modera and Clarendon is another one where there was a general land use plan amendment to make that project happen, and as a result, we got additional density. Replacement housing, another area that we don't typically think of with the affordable housing ordinance, but is entirely enabled by the ordinance. So we have, the county has had since, I believe, 1988 or 1990, the Special Affordable Housing Protection District. But the Code of Virginia, when we put the ordinance through, we included this as well to codify it, to make sure that we can continue doing that and have the authority, the explicit authority from the state. And so this says that when site plans will result in the elimination of existing affordable housing, and actually the state, the wording in the Code of Virginia is more explicit. This is market rate affordable housing under 80% of the area median income, that if that's to be eliminated, that the applicant will address replacement of the housing in the process for the county board's consideration. And so that allows us to step in with the Special Affordable Housing Protection District in those situations. And again, bonus density, which we often don't think of in the same way as the ordinance, is enabled by the ordinance. So the ordinance, the Code of Virginia says the projects that have exceeded the density provided by a county's comprehensive plan shall be subject to an affordable housing requirement in addition to the requirements of the section and the zoning ordinance adopted pursuant to the section. Now, as Anthony laid out for you all, this is done through a negotiation. This isn't formulaic, and so there's other interests in the community benefit package, but and this is among them, affordable housing is the first listed in 15.5.9, but as well as community facilities, sustainable design, adaptive reuse, and other public priorities. But it's a huge component of that. And that's what I have for you tonight. And that's, your task really in your work going forward is to think about, what is the area where you want to intervene and tweak and adjust. So I'll cede it back to you, Brian, for questions.
All right, thank you so much. Oh, Mary, yes.
Hey, Russell, that was good. That was very informative. Thank you so much.
Sure.
So the Pershing Drive special study is kind of interesting to me that they asked for 20% for the GLUP change. Is there a rule of thumb about how much to ask for on a GLUP change emerging, or how does that work?
I would say it's emerging. It's not written, it's not in the ordinance. We have been, as GLUP studies come forward, have been trying to reinforce that 20% as kind of the standard for that. I think there's, precedent is important, and maintaining those is how you build that. I think that certainty, I think when Matt was talking about what developers want, they want to know what it's going to cost them at the end of the day, what the expectations are. And we've been trying to lay that foundation for the GLUP study or GLUP amendment at the 20% level.
And does that replace then the bonus density negotiation, or does the bonus happen on top?
The bonus would happen on top, because if there's a GLUP study, it's going to raise that general land use plan designation, but there's still the possibility to have density above that general land use plan designation. It doesn't always happen, but that's a possibility. Yeah.
Brian, can I ask one more question?
Yes.
So Russell, if we went back and looked at, say, the last, I don't know, I'm going to say 10 years, just because the pandemic was in there.
Mm-hmm.
And we looked at bonus, and we looked at what we got in housing as a percentage of the bonus. Is there a pattern?
Yeah, we'd have to look at that, and that's a good thing to look at. One thing I would point out is that the bonus density had been capped at 25% until I think it was in 2019 or 18?
After I left. It was after I left, for sure.
Yeah, and so we'd be catching those years, because I think since that bonus density was uncapped, we kind of like made the pie much bigger. So before there was a smaller amount of bonus density available. Now there's a larger amount. Obviously, projects still have to fit within the form and fit within the context that they are. They can't, the sky is not quite the limit, even though some.
Well, that's another area I'm interested in, Brian.
All right.
Thank you, Russell.
That's good. Noted. Yes, Jason.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the special GLUP. Would you say that now that you talked about some site plans, they go above the GLUP to get that GLUP, negotiated density, but would you say now that because the special, it seems like the special GLUP studies coming forward now have height limits and other limits that make it so that, going beyond what is prescribed, the density in the GLUP is not possible because there are the other constraints in the recent GLUPs? Like, would you say that's true?
That's probably true, because a GLUP study is usually going to be, it's about that site. They couldn't get there through site plan, because they're not allowed, that density isn't allowed under the general land use plan to get to that site plan density that would be typical. So they're trying to get a different classification so that they can get up to that. And then the study is usually, it's usually pretty well known what the developer is looking for and wants to do. And so they're going to be looking for a GLUP classification that meets that, so that they may not be going to any additional density, because why go through a couple year process of this study if what that study produces is not not the building height that you plan to build, that you plan to build even higher. Not to say that it couldn't be done, but it would kind of be a little bit acting in bad faith unless you were, completely, transparent that yes, I want this GLUP designation, but I will also likely be seeking some bonus density on top of that, or earned density, as Anthony called it as well.
All right. Let's see here for any other questions. I do have one question if no one else has one. Just as we're understanding the last point you made about bonus density and the ways in which that the county can request additional density, can you explain those rare instances in which the county will go out of its way to say circumvent certain parts of the process to extract additional density? I think you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation.
I'm not sure I'm understanding the question entirely, Brian. Can you take
Sorry,
another run at that?
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, towards the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that there were certain unique circumstances where the county, during the site plan process, could kind of unilaterally request additional affordable housing, but it's very, very rare. Maybe I'm misremembering it, but
no, I think you misunderstood. The county can waive all the there's, these are requirements. The county could say there's other competing and compelling public needs that are needed to be addressed through this project, and therefore we're willing to forego the requirements for affordable housing, to have, basically no affordable housing, because we want another set of things. This, to my knowledge, is extremely rare, and there would need to be very, very compelling reasons to do that.
okay, thank you. Just wondering, because when I hear of instances like that, given the sort of just very sweeping powers that seems to imply, and just saying, well, because if there's this extenuating circumstance, we're going to bypass this entire part of the process. Does that apply in reverse, right? Does the county also have the power to say, well, because there's this exigent need for additional affordable housing, we are going to do the inverse?
Yeah, no, because again, this is Simon Says, and so the state of Virginia said that, or we gave them the language basically, but said that, it was an escape door, that if for some reason, there were really important reasons to have a project built and to not comply with the affordable housing component, because there's other they wanted the ability for the board to have a way out of it. So it's not an iron jacket, if you will. But they didn't, it doesn't go the other way, that the board cannot ask for, like, if the project is, the dollar amount comes out to, $99,999,999.99, we can't ask for that 1 cent to round up.
Okay, I see.
But in calculating the units, and this is important, because a unit is a whole decimal unit. It's a figure, If the calculation goes slightly above, the developer, if they were to provide the on-site units, would be on the hook for a entirely new unit. You can't have half a unit or a third of a unit or a quarter of a unit. So it works that way as well.
All right. Thank you. Sorry, my question's a bit confused. I was getting to the end before I actually stated the beginning part, but thank you.
No worries. Happy to clarify.
Yes, Matt.
Russell, good presentation. Thank you. Quick question about AHIF and how it's used for bonus density in rare instances. I think as you laid out 15.5.8, AHIF contribution is one of the options developers can use, and it's the one they generally take. And for bonus density 15.5.9, typically that's achieved through providing on-site CAFs. But in rare circumstances, like I could think of maybe 2 projects in Crystal City, developers got bonus density through additional AHIF contributions. Do you have any context for how that was considered and how that's viewed in the 4.1 process?
Yeah, and I think there have been some projects in Roslyn too, where the valuation is such that it's an incredibly deep subsidy, and so we've taken money rather than units, and certainly, yeah, in Crystal City, I think there were some more recent examples. That it's dependent on any number of factors. I think there's a lot of I believe with the Crystal City recent exceptions, that I think the Crystal House and the need for financing there is one of the factors that was considered in accepting an AHIF contribution instead of units, because it could go farther, and there's the need was there for an existing project, but there could be any number of factors that could sway that. But typically it has been the county's policy to get those 15.5.9 units as on-site affordable units.
All right.
I see Michelle Winters has her.
Yeah, I was just going to comment right before Russell said it's the county's policy. That's what I was going to say. So back when I was on the Housing Commission and Alice was on then as well, there was this whole discussion about how to treat bonus density. So we had just spent a few years interpreting the Affordable Housing Ordinance, even though it seems straightforward now. Back then, there were a lot of discussions, about exactly how to interpret it. But then the next question was, how do you treat bonus density? And I recall there being some sort of internal staff policy that Ken Oggenbaugh, the previous housing director, had sort of put in place that specifically said, if it's bonus density, we will make it on site. So it's a staff level policy as opposed to something established at the county board level.
That's right.
Does that make sense?
There's not a written policy document that says that anywhere, but the practice has been to largely have negotiate for on-site units, but that again, that's a policy through kind of practice and implementation.
All right. Joe.
Yeah, Russell, thank you for the presentation. Is that FAR calculation industry standard that all communities use?
Yeah, that's the same way floor area ratios are calculated.
It
pretty
just
much
seems
universally.
It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle. You really have to think it through to understand the calculations. So
yeah.
Okay.
But if you just think of the total square foot, the gross floor area divided by what that site area is, but there's any number of geometric combinations that will get you to the same kind of floor area ratio.
All right. Thank you.
All right. With that, there are no other additional questions. Russell, thank you so much for that excellent presentation. And again, I'd like to reiterate my desire to have all this information from our various speakers today available for public use and reference on the county website, just so we can refresh ourselves throughout this process, in addition to having the public be able to access these resources. I think they've all been very informative and helping to kind of clarify a lot of the very technical aspects of this process, and will be useful as we try to do our engagement efforts throughout the year moving forward. So thank you so much for your help with all this. And with that, if there are no other points of order or questions, I'd like to adjourn this meeting, and we will all meet again in person, this time in June. For our next meeting, we'll discuss ways in which we and our usage of the Affordable Housing Ordinance compare to nearby localities, namely Fairfax and Alexandria. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Brian.